This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today I am welcoming a new guest, and that is Amanda Hartsell. Amanda, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. How about you?
Doing pretty good. We just got over a big, what we call a snowstorm here in Kagoshima. Back in Chicago, it's nowhere near as tough. But slowly, it's all gone now, fortunately. But before we go too much into stuff, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so my name is Amanda. I am I guess I would say an up-and-coming YouTuber. I have a channel under my name, Amanda Hartsell, where I focus on evaluating Japanese films. I've mostly focused on evaluations on older Japanese films, such as films by like Kurosawa and Ozu. I recently came out with a video about the career of Setsuko Hara, who you would know from Ozu's films. So I also have a blog on Medium where I talk about write articles about Japanese cinema as well. So, and one of the reasons why I chose today's film was because I speak about it extensively in my first video about the noirs of Akira Kurosawa.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, and we are going to be talking about High and Low is the movie. That is, like you said, the Akira Kurosawa film from 1963. Japanese title is Tengoku to Jigoku, which is literally translated as Heaven and Hell. So, and I want to talk about that choice for the translation of the title, but we'll get to that. And before we dive too much into the movie, you also live in Japan, don't you?
Yes, I live in Tokyo. So I was actually surprised that you said that it was snowing in Kagoshima. I did not know it snowed around there because I thought it was warmer than Tokyo. So that's interesting.
That was one of the big surprises I had too, coming from Chicago. And I read online when I got assigned to Kagoshima that, oh, it's like, it's subtropical, so it's pretty nice year round. It's the Naples of Japan is what a lot of people describe it as. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to need a winter coat or anything like that. And then as soon as like October, November rolls around, I'm emailing my dad asking like, can you please send my winter coat? But we don't get much snow, but February tends to be like the coldest month. And then we usually get like maybe 1 or 2 days of snow. And then after that, it's gone. So not too bad, fortunately, at least nothing compared to Chicago. But how long have you been in Japan?
I moved here in October, and part of the reason why I moved here was, well, I have been interested in Japanese film and culture for a while now. And I want to kind of find a way to kind of break out into the Japanese entertainment industry in some way, and also learn the language. And I think one of the advantages that I have for my channel is that I'll be talking about Japanese movies, and I want to kind of get outside and make videos that also incorporate Japanese buildings and just kind of going outside. I'm going to be doing filming for my next video this weekend with a friend that I met at my Japanese school. So I'm very excited about that. But yeah, I my Japanese is pretty low, but I do see myself living here long term.
Well, welcome. There are two types of people when they first come here. There are the ones who end up just staying for a short time, and there are those like me who we affectionately call ourselves lifers. So maybe you'll be one of the latter.
I hope so.
So what brought you to Japan? What got you interested in Japanese culture and made you kind of want to make the jump to moving over here?
So in college, I got a degree in international relations, and at first my focus was on the Middle East, and then I began um, taking classes on Asian history and politics, and I just became very interested in East Asia, but in particular Japan. And I also feel like at least like moving to Japan, it's probably the easiest country for like a Westerner to move to in Asia, because I think that it's I think a lot of Japan has been, even though it's like still Asia, I think a lot of aspects of the culture have been westernized. And it's I guess like in terms of me getting into film specifically, I think what happened was I was watching a lot of YouTube videos about like movies and reviews, and I wasn't actually watching movies. I was just watching these YouTube videos as like entertainment. And I was like, I need to start like actually watching movies in order to get like an appreciation for these like YouTube videos. And so I kind of like looked at things that my favorite YouTubers liked, and a lot of it wasn't for me. And so I thought, oh, I'm really interested in Japanese culture. I should watch Japanese films. And so I just kind of typed into Google top Japanese films to watch, and it's the typical stuff that you imagine would be on there: Kurosawa, Rashomon, Seven Samurai, Tokyo Story. And I just kind of, for a while, just kind of like hunted down different Japanese films, especially like from the classic era. One film that was also very important to me when I was first exploring Japanese cinema was Shoplifters, because it was late 2018 when I started kind of just going ham on watching all these Japanese films. And obviously, if you type in like Japanese movies, the Palme d'Or winner was one of the things that came up. And so that movie was also very impactful for me. And it kind of showed me like what cinema could be. And I still have seen like a lot of American and European films, but I always find myself like really being attracted to Japanese films. And also like I was living in Spain at the time. And like not being in Japan and not coming from that cultural context, watching Japanese films helped me to get closer to the culture and to learn more. Like it made me also interested in other aspects of Japanese history. Like I still don't fully understand what was going on during the Sengoku Jidai era, but I know who Oda Nobunaga is now. I know that if you're watching a movie and somebody says, I fight for the Takeda clan, that they are screwed. But it just was a way for me to connect to the culture in a way that was not really, there was not really many other avenues in which to do that. And I've just been very especially interested in like the golden age of Japanese cinema from like the late 40s into the late 60s. I've also seen a lot of like modern films as well. But that's where like my focus has been.
Very cool. Yeah, you're humming my tune when you mentioned Shoplifters. That movie is incredible. It was one of the I think it was like maybe like the second or third movie I covered here on the show, and it's just I taught it several years in my class now, and it is just beautiful movie, and definitely Koreeda has quickly become one of my favorite Japanese directors. Like I started off saw Afterlife many years ago, and then nothing from him I didn't see for years, and then I think Shoplifters may have been like the second thing I saw from him, and after that I was just so blown away. And fortunately my wife, she's a big fan of Koreeda, so she kept like recommending other ones. She kept like bringing Koreeda movies home, so I'm just like, so since then I've just become like very infatuated with his work. But it's really interesting that you came into it through, you got a very interesting story for how you became into Japanese cinema, because many of the stories that when I've talked to people here, there tend to be like a few different routes, but they tend to be very similar. Like it's usually an interest in the movies that comes first, and usually that comes in through like maybe a lot of people get in through anime, and then they want to branch out from anime and they start to find the Japanese movies. Other people like me, especially if you were of the millennial generation, we sort of came in when there was that big boom in the early 2000s, when there's all this J horror coming into the West. You had all these DVD producers putting out all these like Japanese horror films, or like kind of like Tartan Asian Extreme and all that kind of stuff, where it's all these kinds of low budget, somewhat schlocky films that they're flooding into the market. And so a lot of us got into it through that, and then we kind of branched out into other Japanese films. And then other people, they come in through stuff like Godzilla, or they get in through the classics like Kurosawa, like Seven Samurai and Ozu and all that. But most of them, it's the movies first, and then the interest in the culture comes after that. You kind of had the opposite, where it's the culture first, and then you got interested in the movies. So I think that's a pretty cool way for you to have gotten into it.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that, but I guess like I've always been also like a big reader, and I also started reading like literature from Japan before. So I guess I kind of just saw it as like films as like an extension of like art and literature, and I'm like, oh, this is probably something that would appeal to me. And I also am very I resonate a lot with a lot of the humanist aspects of like not all Japanese directors I think are humanists, but I think that there is the like after the war, people like a lot of Japanese directors, they imbued their films with like humanism and criticism of the system and society. And I think that you don't really see that in as much in classic American films. And so that really resonated with me. And so I think that yeah, it was just I think an appreciation for the culture and for art in general, that it was just kind of a natural progression of my interest to start getting into Japanese cinema.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I was thinking the same thing too, because and when you compare it to American films, there's always this talk about liberal Hollywood and all that kind of stuff. When you look at a lot of the movies, they are fairly mainstream as far as like American public opinion goes, especially on things like the military and stuff like that. Whereas Japanese society has very largely been described as more conservative leaning, and at least socially conservative. And I think in a lot of ways that's true. I think there's also a big apathy problem that also doesn't get covered in that discussion too, but that's a much more complex issue. But when you look at the films, I feel like a lot of these films are surprisingly progressive for the kind of society that they are made in, and especially like the one we're talking about today. I can't imagine, a big name director at this time, like, I don't know, John Ford or something like that, making such a pretty blatantly anti-capitalist movie during the 60s in America. I just can't see that happening. But Kurosawa, he's like one of the most well-known directors in the world at this point. He's come riding high off things like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, and he makes this movie that is very critical of the kind of hyper-capitalism that was taking hold in Japan at the time. And yeah, that's just something that you don't see a lot in Western movies.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the movie is so critical of capitalism at the time that it came out, because you got to think 1963, things in Japan economically are booming. And if you think about what happened, what like the country less than 20 years ago was completely destroyed. People, you mentioned that you had read the book Embracing Defeat. I've also read that book, and like life after in the post-war years between like 1945 and 1950, or they're just absolutely unbearable. People are, starving. Millions of people are homeless. People are living in essentially hovels, and the country doesn't really come out of that until like the 50s, and like by the 1960s they're this big economic power. And we see that in the film where there's all these beautiful shots of Yokohama, and it's clearly this pretty affluent town. You see ships coming in from the harbor, business is booming, and yet it seems like people would be like, oh, things are great, because they lived through absolute hell for 5 years, right after the war. And yet Kurosawa, he's kind of saying like, no, that isn't good enough. There's still this underbelly of our society that has not been taken care of, who has been left behind, and we need to talk about it. And so I think that that's I really like that ethos of it, of like, no, this isn't good enough because there's still this class of people that has been left behind, and we need to think about them as well, not just, outward appearances and what the top part of society, how that they're doing well again now.
Yeah, especially because this came out in the run up of the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo. And one of the most heartbreaking stories I remember reading about the Olympics, and I despise the Olympics for a whole host of reasons. And one of the reasons this story I'm about to tell, this is a perfect encapsulation of why. There was this woman who, during the lead up to the Summer Olympics in 1964, her home was bought up by the Olympic Committee, and she was forced to move out of her home. And so she was forced to relocate and everything. And then when the 2020 Olympics came around, the exact same thing happened to her. She was forced out of her home again to make for this second Olympics. And it's just like, these things, it's like the excesses of capitalism are full on display with the Olympics, where it's all these, they're making all these big promises to the people there, and then they just come in, they hoover up all the wealth, they exploit all the resources, and then the town is left holding the bag at the end. And I feel like for Kurosawa to make this film that is calling this stuff out in a time when Japan is trying to present its image as, look at how amazing we are, is really is a bold statement.
Yeah, because I do think at that time they were trying to kind of say like, oh, see, we've gotten out of the rubble, we've moved on from the war, but Kurosawa is clearly not satisfied with that. And I think it's interesting because I've read criticisms of like Kurosawa saying like, oh, well, he wasn't like talking about social issues enough. And I think that in this film, like, when the first time I saw it, I didn't make the connection. I'm not sure why. It only really like dawned on me on a second viewing. I had a really great second viewing because I was able to see it in a theater with like it was the AFI at Silver Springs in Maryland. I used to live in DC, and it was on this huge screen, and it dawned on me the connection that he was trying to make about like, this income inequality and economic discrepancies in Japan. And the connection came to me there. And I think maybe the reason why it was lost on me is because I think it is done in like a subtle way. And I think that there's also a lot going on in the movie where it's like, there's the train scene and there's a kidnapper and there's a lot of plot. And so maybe that I was focusing on that on my first viewing, and my second viewing, I was able to get like the deeper meaning behind it. But that's also what I have found so fascinating about the film, especially I don't know if it's okay to like say this already so soon in this discussion, but like you get the sense that like the kidnapper is not the real villain of the movie. You get the sense that it is society, it is capitalism. He is just kind of reacting to the mistreatment that he has experienced his whole life. And like, yeah, it's misdirected. Taking down Gondo doesn't change anything, but it's also a tragedy what happened to him as well as what has happened to Gondo.
Yeah. So maybe it's my political leanings. I identify as an anti-capitalist and a democratic socialist, so I tend to like zero in on any sort of anti-capitalist message like a laser every time it pops up in a movie. So I mean, I've only seen this once. I just saw it last night. This is my first viewing of it. So I do want to see it again, absolutely, because I feel like there's a lot of stuff that I'm not quite, fully grasping at this point. But yeah, I zeroed in on that right away, just again, probably because of my leanings. But yeah, there is a lot going on in the movie. And I think also the fact that, the kidnappers and here's one of the things where I think there's sort of a weakness here is I don't think we spend enough time with the kidnapper and his motivations. I understand where they're coming from with his resentment, but I feel like it's, like you said, it's a little bit misplaced here. And I feel like we could have spent a little bit more time interacting with him and sort of why that resentment comes up. Instead, it just gets kind of almost like a little bit info dumpy at the end when he's explaining it to Gondo.
Yeah, I think that Kurosawa was certainly more interested in Gondo's personal journey and psychology. But I do think that there are a lot of like little details that kind of show like why the kidnapper is so resentful of him. Like I think that it's a lot of visuals and not a lot of like talking. Like, you know, when we first see him, we see him reflected through the dirty pond and he's going into this slum. And you have to imagine like, yeah, anybody living in that situation does not have it good and did not come from like good circumstances. And also we see in his house that his window has a direct view of Gondo's house. So every time he looks out the window, he has to see Gondo living like essentially above him, towering over him, having this so much better life while he is either sweltering in the summer or freezing in the winter. And I think that that's where his like obsession comes from. And I do think that there could have been more in terms of like what his backstory is, but I think that like on multiple viewings, I've just kind of figured like this. I can tell that this guy's life has not been easy and has not been good, and I see why he has become so bitter. And I talk a little bit in my video that like, you know, he could spend his time like trying to bring down capitalism, but realistically speaking, that's going to take decades and it probably won't even happen in his lifetime. Well, but like taking down Gondo, that's something that he can realistically do in a short span of time. It's not really emotionally satisfying like taking down a system, but taking out a guy and watching him and his family suffer, that's more immediate. And even though it's like misdirected on an emotional level, you see why he would want to do that.
Yeah, I'm seeing there's some, you know, you can make some comparisons here between this and, you know, what happened in America with the United Healthcare CEO and Luigi Mangione and all that stuff. So I mean, it's not exactly because he came from kind of a little bit more of a privileged background, but you could definitely see some connective tissue between those things. So it's kind of prescient that we're talking about this movie at this point. I want to talk about the title real quick too. So it's, you know, again, the Japanese title is Tengoku to Jigoku, which, you know, literally translates to heaven and hell. But in the West, it was translated as high and low. What did you think about that translation of the title?
So I get the translation change because I think if you presented that title to Western audiences, they would immediately think it's like religious and think that this is a film that maybe delves into religion, which I don't think it is really the case. But I do think that the title in Japanese is more apt for the movie because there is, I think it is more powerful. And also, I think, you know, if you see the film, there is, it's very focused on like the temperature that all of the characters are experiencing. Like in Gondo's home, in the first the first main scenes of the film, you don't notice it because they're in air conditioning. They're fine. It's a super hot day in Yokohama, but they're in air conditioning. They're cool, like you would be in heaven, being like normal, comfortable temperature. But as you kind of go down the rung, the police, they don't have, you notice like in the scene with the, when they're talking about the kidnapper and the investigation, they have fans all over the police office, meaning they don't have air conditioning. They have to use these tiny little fans to cool themselves off. And the people in the slum, they don't have anything. They're living in a very hot, the harder, and they pretty much have to live in the heat wave. And at the same time, there's also different levels. Like Gondo is literally above a slum. The people in the slum can see him, and so he's kind of living in heaven while these people in the slum are living in hell. And so I think that knowing I understand why they made the change, but like I think that the title in Japanese is much more apt to what is going on in the film itself.
Yeah, I had similar thoughts about that too. Whereas I was thinking like, oh, maybe it would have been better if they called it Heaven and Hell, but then I started second guessing myself and arguing with myself and saying, well, no, just like you said, I feel like people would have misread that as a religious context and then would have been confused when they got to it. So yeah, I understand going with high and low. And also, yeah, the social positions we have there, the physical positioning of their homes. The temperature thing is a very interesting thing that you talked about too, because I didn't quite pick up on that at first, but now that you mention it, these images are coming back, and yeah, he's in this, perfect climate controlled environment, completely shut off from the rest of the world. There's the one scene where he opens the windows and you hear all the sounds from outside. And then once he closes the windows, it becomes completely silent again. So it just shows just like how closed off the wealthy and privileged are from the rest of society. Whereas when you go down into like the nightclubs or the bars and all that kind of stuff, it's just nonstop assault on your senses, on your smell, on your ears, on your eyes. All of it is just, relentless and feeling too, because those people are crammed so close together in those small spaces. Whereas in those opening shots, I think, and I thought it was interesting how he photographed the shots in the beginning, because it felt almost like a stage play in the first part when they're mostly in Gondo's house. And I was thinking, it was reminding me a lot of Tokyo Story, where it's like these very long shots, these very and these very far shots that linger for a long time. And he does that for a good portion of the movie. The camera pretty much just stays in that location. And, I was kind of wondering why. And then once we get into the lower town areas and we see the slums and it's just like everybody's crammed together, then I kind of understood. I'm like, oh, okay, I see. He's really trying to emphasize the amount of just sheer physical space that the wealthy are able to have. And this, now that you live in Japan, is that space is a premium here. If you live in a place like Tokyo, you're going to have to be paying a lot of money for a very small place. And also the thing that, the kidnapper mentions at the end about about his home, how it's, it's so freezing in the winter, and in the summer it's so swelteringly hot that he can't even sleep. That's exactly what it is like in most of these in these homes. I'm not sure if you live in a newer type of place, but I live in an older house here, and these older homes, they are not built for they're not built for heat retention or to cool down. They are built basically to allow air to pass freely through here. So that means in the winter, it gets unbelievably freezing in these places. Even in a place like Kagoshima, where, like I said, you think about it as being warm, especially in comparison to like Chicago, where it's like, oh, okay, it only gets down to, about 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter. That's not so bad. But then you realize that that's like the same temperature outside is what it is inside.
Yeah, and also I've just learned this, a lot of houses in Japan, I think most, don't have central heating. So like in the building that I live in, which is a pretty new building, the common areas and the hallways are not heated. So every time I go outside, every time I leave my bedroom, it's essentially the same temperature as it is outside. So
yeah. Newer homes, they're starting to have things like central heating. They're starting to have things like the heated floors, which they use, especially in Hokkaido a lot. That's starting to become like a nationwide thing. But there's still a lot of old homes here. And the homes here, too, they're not really built to last. Mostly they're built to last about maybe 30 to 50 years. Unlike, And they do that intentionally to deal with the fact that, there are a lot of natural disasters here and that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit easier to deal with that way. Whereas like in America, like I grew up in a house that was like 100 years old and it was fine for the most part. So now I want to talk about Gondo and how his position, because I don't know if you've ever heard the podcast Behind the Bastards.
No.
Okay, so it's a great podcast, and it does these and it goes into detail about like the worst people in history. And they did a series of episodes on Jack Welch, who was the I think it was the General Motors CEO, and how he was like the first of this new kind of capitalist that really kind of twisted the way capitalism was working. Because up until Welch, you had these capitalists and these captains of industry who, yeah, they were cutthroat, but they also did have some degree of moral responsibility to society. Like they did feel like the need to give back in some way, and like the terms of like investments into social infrastructure and that kind of stuff. And Welch was kind of like the first of these CEOs who was like, no, let's not do that. We just have to focus on extracting as much profit as possible. And he kind of was like the start of what we have now with late stage capitalism, what Cory Doctorow called about the enshittification of everything. And you see that right here in this opening scene when he's talking with these other executives, and they're like, oh, well, these shoes, the problem with these shoes is they're too good, and so we're not making enough money because, and then he tears apart that he's like, look, I take pride. I want to make a quality product, right? I want the people to have these shoes that can last a long time. And I think, that's a responsibility we have, is not just to extract as much wealth as possible, but to make a good product. And, he used the example of the shoe they show him. He's like, look at this thing. And he tears it all apart right in front of him. This is bullshit. And this is why he has this mission to buy up the company, because he wants to basically save the company from these parasites, essentially. And so that's why I think and then, you have the kidnapper who comes after Gondo. And again, this is where I feel like it's misplaced, which could also be intentional, but it's, he's going after, I hesitate to use the word good capitalist, but he's going after, the closest thing we have to a good capitalist in this movie, because even the workers, they're like, yeah, he's got a temper. He's kind of a tough guy, but he treats us well. None of us, hate working for him or anything like that.
Yeah. I think it's also like, that's the reason why he ultimately, I think, fails in the movie. Not like fails, but like why he's brought down is because he is a good capitalist, and there is no room for good capitalists in this world. There's only room for the cutthroat people that we see at the beginning of the movie. Like him being like, oh, should I save Shinichi, who I don't have any real moral or legal obligation to save? And I think Kurosawa was saying like something like very interesting, like, does the child of a chauffeur and the child of a businessman both deserve to, are their lives equal? And he's saying yes, that we as human beings have a responsibility to take care of each other, and unfortunately, like in capitalism, that's punished. You're supposed to just let the kid die and take over the company. And I do think that like he does want to save the company also, but I think there's also an element of like he thinks that he knows, and like, yeah, I think that like his strategy for the company long term is better. But I think there's also an element of it is for his ego to like take over. Like he has amassed all of this wealth and power. He wants to go the next step.
Yeah, there is that aspect of it too. This idea of the rich guy who thinks he knows better than everybody else. Absolutely. I mean, in this case, he is right when he's compared to those other guys. But yeah, there's you see that with like, Bill Gates meddling with education, thinking he knows better than everybody else, and then ends up screwing the whole thing up. Obviously what's happening with Elon Musk and all that. There are countless examples you can find of these people who, because they become rich, they feel like they're smarter than everybody else, and they feel like they're the ones who should be dictating the way society works. And that's not really how it works. But we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk more about this movie.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Psst, healthcare pros, word's out, and it's too good to keep quiet. Look, LinkedIn is revolutionizing job hunting, making it possible to search by specialty, shift preference, and salary. Endless scrolling is out. Whether it's a mental health therapist or dental hygienist, finding the perfect role is faster and easier than ever. Head to linkedin.com/healthcare and start your search today.
And we are back. Now, one of the things, too, I wanted to discuss is the idea of kind of like class navigation, because Japan is an interesting type of society, whereas it is a very equal society now, but Japan has a feudal history, and elements of feudalism still exist in some form in different ways. And especially at this time period, those types of feudalistic elements were still very common, right? It was the class you're born into largely determines like the class you will be in for the rest of your life. And social mobility was pretty difficult. And you kind of see this where, Gondo is someone who has worked hard and has risen up in the ranks. And one of the things he's worried about when it comes to whether or not he should help Shinichi is this idea of like, if I do this, I will basically become bankrupt and I will have to start off from nothing. And his wife says, "Oh, but you know what? That's fine. I'm fine with doing that. But we have a responsibility." And he says to her, he's like, "You were born into privilege. You don't know what you're committing to right now." And you also have these other these other guys in the company too, who also probably came from a life of privilege, who were probably born into wealthy families, got to go to good schools, probably got these jobs at these companies because, their daddy was golf buddies with the CEO or something like that. And Gondo is, and you see where Gondo is one of these people who he seems to believe in the idea of social mobility, meritocracy, and, you work hard, you get to rise up through the ranks. And I feel like, too, Takeuchi, the kidnapper, may have had a similar type of idea, because obviously he does come from a underprivileged background as well. And he's a medical intern. So I'm guessing he was also had this idea of, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to study hard, I'm going to become a doctor, and I'm going to have this same social mobility that, capitalism says we can all have. And what he realizes, and I think this is where I feel like we should have had a little bit more background with like him and Gondo and like his experience, his resentment of Gondo, because I think if we focus on the idea that Gondo is actually the exception as opposed to the rule for this meritocracy, that it would have driven that message a lot further if, Takeuchi had known more about Gondo's background or something like that, but instead of just where it comes off almost like he's just envious of Gondo just in general, as opposed to it specifically being, we came from the same place, but I work just as hard as you, and yet I'm still, freezing every night or sweating to death in the summer while you get to live in this posh mansion up on the hill looking down on all of us. So that was one of the things I found interesting, was that aspect of the social mobility between the classes.
I also wanted to note that, and I didn't talk about this in my video, but I should have. There's a comment made where I believe it was Gondo's assistant said that it was his wife's dowry that helped help build his fortune. So there is a level of, I knew the right people at the right time, and nepotism that helped him get to the top. So I think that was an interesting, I wish maybe that was a little bit more out there, because I definitely only noticed that on again, a second viewing. But I think it's also a kind of another nudge of Kurosawa saying it's not just he worked hard. It's also there was also generational wealth at play here. It wasn't his, it was his wife's, but like um, I think that also kind of points to it's not just pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's also having access to generational capital. But yeah, I do think that maybe having some more like why knowing a little bit more about Gondo and his life story would have made Takeuchi more like would have sort up his motivations a bit. I agree with that.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the dowry part because I picked up on that too, where he had mentioned it's like, this is actually your wife's money. So she's the one who she does get to have a say in what happens to it. And yeah, you're right. That's that other thing that, is left out in a lot of these, like, you see all these things about these top 10 lists about, oh, the richest people, they say these are the paths to success. And then it's like the one that's always left out is, oh, I came from I got $1 million loan from daddy or something like that. Or, my parents were able to give me educational opportunities that weren't accessible to 99.9% of children in my generation. And it's like, those things matter. And, just completely erasing them is, it, completely discounts that aspect of it. And yeah, and I'm glad Kurosawa had that little line in there. But like you, I also wish there was a little bit more. It lingered a little bit on that because you're right. It is something that if you're not paying attention or if you're not paying attention at just the right moment or watching it like in a second or third viewing, it's something you can easily miss as like the commentary he's making there. And I feel like that commentary would have been better to explore a little bit more in detail. Also, too, there's this aspect of the Americanization coming into Japan, and Kurosawa seems to have a very interesting relationship with American influence on Japan because he was influenced by a lot of Western movies. Yojimbo was basically, more or less an adaptation of Red Harvest. This was an adaptation of Ed McBain's King's Ransom. And, a lot of his samurai stuff was influenced by noir films or Western films, which then too, there was this cross-cultural influence on his stuff being influenced on things like, the spaghetti Westerns or Star Wars and so much of that stuff. But at the same time, so even though he does seem to have this affinity for American media, he also has this kind of critical eye about the American influence on Japan. And you can kind of see that in these bar scenes where you've got, all these Americans in there. There's this catering to American taste with American drinks and signs written in English, and the music is all American music. And then you look at, even the boys, right? We have Shinichi and what was his son's name?
June.
I can't remember. Yeah, June. Thank you.
June.
So you have so right at the first thing we see them in is they're playing cops and robbers basically in like American style dress. So what did you think about the Americanization aspect of this movie?
Well, I also wanted to note that it's not just Americanization, but there's also like not very much traditional Japanese imagery at all in the film. It's really just Kyoko Kagawa's kimono. And by the end of the film, she's not wearing a kimono anymore. She's wearing Western style clothing. So I think that, I think part of it has to do with evoking like the style of noir films, which I think in Japan, a lot of the times they tried toning down the traditional Japanese imagery in those style films. But yeah, also that like, our we're kind of just emulating their culture, but also capitalism. The US didn't invent capitalism, but they certainly ran with it. And so this, I think also like the fact that they're emulating the US, I think he's also stating that like we're also emulating aspects of capitalism from them. And it also reminds me a little bit of Parasite, where it's also this social commentary about capitalism and class conflict. And there's also a lot of imagery of like American things and kind of this idea that like we should be emulating the Americans because they're rich and we also want to be rich. And also there's in Asia in general, I think that well, at least in Japan and Korea, I think there's this idea that like Western things are inherently like more what's a good word? Prestigious, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
And even if it's something that like we in our own culture wouldn't consider prestigious, like there's not sorry, I'm getting off topic, but like there's a funny scene from Tampopo where like there's these women having an etiquette class with spaghetti, and it's like in the West, spaghetti is like ramen to us. This is not a fancy dish at all. You don't need to take an etiquette class on how to eat spaghetti, and it's because there is just, I think, this idea that like American and Western things are just more prestigious, and I think that that's it's showing kind of that they're taking a lot of aspects from our culture that without really fully understanding them, and also not really appreciating that just because like they shouldn't copy us for certain things like capitalism and stuff like that. I think that it's also just kind of commentary on like they're taking from our culture, and our culture is also heavily capitalistic. So I think it's just an exchange upon an exchange.
Yeah, there that whole fetishization of the other type of thing, which you see that a lot in Asia when it comes to like Western things, and also vice versa. You see that also in America when it comes to especially Japanese things, whether it's media or video games or food or anything like that. And you see the same thing here, like even like the bad English t-shirts and things like that. Where, and so yeah, that aspect of it very much so. Also, you'd mentioned embracing defeat earlier too, and I think that's also a very good thing to look at, because you did have this situation where at the end of the war, all the cutthroat capitalists and the fascists, they were all imprisoned and forced out of government, and then the political prisoners were rushing in to fill in these positions, and then it was the CIA is just like, well, wait a minute, this is too socialistic for us. We got to go back to these war criminals and we got to let them out, and we got to kind of let them off the hook so that we can, engineer this, a set rapid capitalization here. So there, I think there could be some commentary about, I'm not sure how much of this was public knowledge at the time, but I have seen that kind of theme pop up in Kurosawa's work. And that could just be me, seeing into things myself, but I think there is that aspect of it that can't be completely discounted.
I think that he probably was just aware of it, because I think that in his work you see kind of, I think, this just distrust of authority that like I think in most of his films, like whoever is in charge is usually somebody who does not have everyone's best interests at heart, that they are just kind of not I guess like maybe in his like later films, but I do feel like he's very distrustful of authority, and kind of assumes that whoever's in charge is probably just in it for their own self-interest. And that could be like he had a lot of issues with Toho in his career with his films, and I think it's also has to do with the war of he was very restricted on what he could do, and also just in general a lot of Japanese people were very upset, understandably, after the war, because they felt that they had been lied to and forced to suffer for an unwinnable war. And so I think that he was probably aware that that this was going on, that like that the people who were the cause of all of this mass suffering in Japan were kind of just getting a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, issues with authority, that's a very good point, especially because like you said, he was active in the war. That's when he first started directing was during the wartime years. So he experienced the censorship both times. He experienced it from the Japanese side when it's like, you can criticize the Americans all you want, but you can't criticize the Japanese at all. And then during the occupation, it's the complete opposite. Now it's like, you can criticize the Japanese government all you want, but you can't say anything bad about, about the Americans. So now it's like this whiplash happening back and forth. And that even happened with one of his movies. I'm blanking on the name of it now, but also had this kind of thing where he made this movie under under the wartime occupation, where he had to deal with the American censors and find ways to get around him.
Was it Drunken Angel?
Drunken Angel, yes, thank you. I was trying to look at it. Yeah, we had talked about that in the previous scene. The name just completely flew out of my mind right at the time I was going to talk about it. But even like the idea of heroin, right? This idea of where they're explicitly referring to it as heroin. I mean, there were plenty of drugs in Japan at that time, right? Methamphetamines were very common, were commonly abused in the post-war years, and even during the war too. They were given to the soldiers to make them fight harder and longer. But here it's explicitly heroin, which also draws another, comparison, or at least, a connection to American society.
I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with like the drug use in Japan at this time.
Okay.
I do know that it does them going into the drug den, I think also feeds into the idea of them like kind of going deeper into hell.
Mm-hmm.
And I also did notice that like with a lot of the scenes like in Gondo's home, his home is like white and pristine, but as they go into like the what would be considered hell scenes, things get a lot darker. But I'm not familiar with it. Maybe you could elaborate more on what you thought about the use of drugs in the film.
Well, again, I'm not super familiar, but I do know that methamphetamines were very commonly used in the war, and they were very commonly abused after the war. And I could be completely off here, but my understanding is that at least I haven't heard as much about heroin being used. It's very possible it was. Very possible this was actually far more common than I know. But I thought that was, at least from my understanding, at least from what I've seen, I haven't encountered a lot of stuff about heroin in as a drug of choice for abuse. So maybe that's, again, this is just me kind of riffing off here. Maybe there was some sort of subtle connection there to the Americanization aspect and kind of this idea of also foreign influence in general, because you can also see that with the Olympics on the horizon too.
Yeah, I know that Kurosawa had the cast go see an actual drug den in Japan, and like he made sure they had like guards with them, so nothing would happen. But so I do think that is probably based off of a real location that was in Tokyo. So yeah, I'm not sure where they would have gotten heroin, but it may have been like a problem that again wasn't really given like a lot of mainstream focus, that he ended up bringing into the foreground.
Yeah. There's also the fact that that when Gondo gets praised by by society, basically, he gets kind of rewarded for his, altruism, I guess, and that he's willing to pay the ransom, whereas the company forces him out, and then there's this big protest against the company as a result of that. What did you think of that part?
I mean, I think that's that makes sense, I guess, narratively. And I think it's just to show that, like, I think that the average person probably does not, like, maybe, people say, oh, I support capitalism, but they don't actually support like the consequences of it. Especially if you're speaking to older people. I feel like sometimes you if you try to like talk to them about socialist stuff, they're just like, I blanket don't like socialism, but I like getting social services, but I don't like social. It's kind of like I think that where the everybody does in theory support saving a child, but like unfortunately in how the system works, in this case, it's not rewarded. Um, so, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I think the point you made about, people talking about how they blanket don't support socialism, and then I mean, my favorite example of this was during the healthcare protests in, back in 2010. You had signs saying stuff like "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." It's like that's exactly what it is. But and I've even seen that here in Japan, where I've had, people say like, "Oh yeah, socialism is bad," and it's like, do you even know what it is that you're against here? Because meanwhile, you're on social insurance, you're getting social insurance for your kids, you have a pension system that you're paying into, you're using public transportation, which is a socialist infrastructure, and it's like you have all these socialist things that you're taking advantage of, and then you're saying you blanket don't like it. So yeah, there is that aspect of it too. And I think also too, there's this, I think in one hand, it is shining this light on how this divide between the upper class and the rest of society, this idea that, the company thinks, oh, we're doing what is good for the company. And then everyone else like, this is not good. This is monstrous what you're doing here. But even too, it also is this tendency in the public to idealize certain figures. I think is something in there too, because the people are all lining up and supporting Gondo and everything like that, and then the fact is they don't know the fact that Gondo for a pretty good chunk of time is like, I'm not going to save my chauffeur's kid. What the fuck, are you crazy? So there is that aspect of it as well.
And that he was plotting a hostile takeover of his factory. And, it's also like a part of the reason why he goes bankrupt is his fault, right? Like nobody, the kidnapper just got him at a really bad time. Like nobody told him to, put a second mortgage on his house, or to take out so much debt. He did that on his own, and I'm not
Right.
sure how much money he had in the bank, but he probably wouldn't have been completely ruined if he hadn't have done that when the kidnapper called. I was also thinking, and I've seen this movie several times. One thing I really dislike is his wife's reaction to hearing that he put out a second mortgage on their house, because he didn't tell her, and I was like, I'm sorry, any woman would freak out and be like, how could you do this? And maybe she should maybe be a little bit more mad at her husband for like, trying to do this hostile takeover behind her back that ultimately like leads to them losing their house. So
Yeah, and also in Japanese culture too, there is this kind of stereotype of the woman, of the wife being kind of like demure and submissive. The reality is the woman basically runs the house. Like in many cases, she's controlling the bank account and she is giving her husband allowance money. You see that a lot in a lot of Japanese households. And I think this is another issue I've noticed with Kurosawa. As much as I love his movies, I don't feel that he's got a particularly good attitude towards his female characters. They tend to be underwritten. They tend to not have a whole lot of agency in the movies. They tend to just be almost like window dressing in a lot of cases.
yeah, absolutely. In my video about Setsuko Hara, I talked about No Regrets for Our Youth. I don't know if you've seen that film, but the main character, played by Setsuko Hara, has her motivations are all over the place. It's impossible to really understand what she wants. And I think that in general, like he's not really interested in his female characters. And that's not to say that like sometimes like they're interesting. And I think that also, I think if you compare it to character, like female characters from like Truffaut or Godard, like it's a little bit more, I think, palatable. But yeah, I do feel like that is one of his biggest weaknesses as a director. And I do think that like I love Kyoko Kagawa. She's one of my favorite actresses, and I think that she was in quite a few Kurosawa films, and I think that she brought a level of depth to the characters, even though they were underwritten. But I do feel like, this character should have had more of a say and more agency, considering that one, a lot of it is her money that has helped build Gondo up, and two, she lives in that house too. She should have a say of whether or not they're going to gamble it. It's
Yeah.
just a little strange that she's not like mad at him at all. She's just like, oh, just pay the money, and she's not like, what the hell is wrong with you? You could have at least told me. Like so.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. Yeah. And those are kind of the only things, the biggest things I had to talk about here. Was there any other things that you wanted to mention about this movie? Anything that we didn't pick up yet?
Let me see. I made a few notes. Maybe I can pick a point. I did want to mention, and this is um, wait, can you still hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I did want to mention, and this is a scene that like I am like obsessed with, is when he is going back to the hut by the sea to because to try to kill his accomplices because he thinks they're still alive. There is a shot where he's wearing these sunglasses and he is looking directly into the camera and looking directly into the ocean and and you can see in the sunglasses the ocean and the mountain that the boy Shinichi drew, saying that this is where they put me. And I'm like fascinated by this scene because I don't know how they did it. Like he's looking directly into the camera and I don't see like he's not even at an angle, so I don't know how they did it, but I'm like always fascinated by that scene. I also wanted to point out that if you've seen Kurosawa's other noir films, this kind of feels like it's been built up by those films. Like in Drunken Angel, we see very similar themes of like an individual trying to never mind. Like all like Drunken Angel, Stray Dog, and The Bad Sleep Well, they're all noirs, and I think they're all building up to what High and Low ultimately does. And there are a lot of, I think, commonalities that I've seen among those films. Like in Stray Dog, there is this, they're also in a heat wave trying to find a criminal. And it's done in, I think, a very hammy way in that film, because every 2 seconds, basically on screen, somebody is doing something to indicate that it's hot. Like they're wiping their face because they're sweaty, or they have a fan that they're waving in front of their face, or they're eating a popsicle. And it's done, I think, to much better and more nuanced effect in High and Low. And there is in The Bad Sleep Well, which I think is also like it's a great ride, but maybe not a great ending. It's also talking about like rabid capitalism and cutthroat capitalism, and it's a little bit more in your face than High and Low, because they're just outwardly murdering people. Well, I mean, they're doing that in High and Low, but like the capitalists are also just outwardly murdering people in broad daylight. But there's one like connection that I saw upon like my third viewing of the film that I connected back to Drunken Angel, which was there's a famous scene in Drunken Angel where Toshinomi Fune's character has a carnation, and it's supposed to symbolize like he's going to start taking care of his life because he has tuberculosis. But then the Yakuza Okada comes and kind of sucks him back into Yakuza life. And so he throws the carnation into the dirty pond to kind of symbolize he's throwing his life away. You see a similar scene in High and Low where Takeuchi, he has a carnation on his chest and he pulls it out of his shirt while he's in this drug den. And he plays with it as he's looking at this woman who he is about to essentially inject with heroin to kill her, and he throws it away. And I think that that is supposed to be kind of like Kurosawa is harkening back to his old film. And I feel like I only noticed it on like a third viewing because like it's very subtle, but I think that it's a very interesting, uh, it's very interesting to see Kurosawa having evolved through his career because it's like in Drunken Angel, like it's a great movie, but I don't think it's as polished as his later works. And so I feel like by High and Low, it's like he is just like peaking as a director and not like a bad way in a he knows how to make a movie type of way.
No, I think that's very well said. I agree. Like I saw we'd covered Drunken Angel, I think like last 2 seasons ago or something like that, and yeah, there's a definite rough quality to it, especially when you compare it to this. And part of that could also be the fact because that was under the wartime occupation, so he had to deal with censors and he had to try and find ways around the censors and all that. So um, the more freedom he has here could definitely have been a factor in that. But yeah, I agree. I think he keeps revisiting a lot of these themes. It kind of reminds me of the old, I almost hesitate to quote him because he's a bastard, but the old Woody Allen quote is like, I'm going to keep making the same movie until I make it right. And I feel like with Kurosawa's noir films, there's something like that at play. It feels like he is, revisiting a lot of these things and trying to tinker with them and trying to get it better each time.
Yeah, and I think that he succeeded here.
Mhm.
As much as we discussed like some of the problems overall, I think that this film is a masterpiece and it's one of his strongest films. It's my second favorite of his next to Throne of Blood. And it to me, I think it is one of his more like underrated films. And I think that has to do with the fact that people like samurai and people are just they want to approach Kurosawa through his samurai films first. Um, and maybe this is a better film to watch if you're already familiar with Kurosawa, because I think it'll be appreciated more. But I do feel like there isn't as much discussion about this film as opposed to his like samurai films and Ikiru. And I think that this film is very prescient today, as we are just full steam ahead in late stage capitalism. I think this movie is has not aged very much. It's very prescient to what's happening today.
Absolutely, yes. And yeah, I mean, because when you had mentioned High and Low in your email, like this is a movie I've heard the title before, but other than that, if you put a gun to my head before, I got your email about this movie, I would have been like, oh, High and Low. Yeah, that sounds kind of familiar, but I have no idea what it's about. Nothing. I had no sort of frame of reference for this movie whatsoever, other than the fact that I know it's a Kurosawa film, and that's all I really knew about it. And I didn't know, is it a Yakuza? I think I had it. I think I knew that it was one of his contemporary movies where he was making it in the time period that it was set in the time period he was making it in. But I didn't know if it was like a Yakuza film or if it was a human drama or what. I didn't know anything about it until I found the video and I'm like, oh, okay, it's a noir film about a kidnapping. Okay, that's interesting. But yeah, I don't think that, and I think a lot of these movies some of these movies they do get overshadowed by the samurai ones or some of the more, like even I think Drunken Angel has more of a reputation than maybe this one does.
Yeah, I
Because
agree.
or also Stray Dog too. That's another one that also has a much stronger reputation than this one. I don't think a lot of people really think about High and Low, whereas, and I haven't seen all his noir films, so I don't know where I'd rank this in all of them, but I do think I definitely enjoyed it more than Drunken Angel. I will agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to rank his noir films, and I know a lot about them because I made a over 30-minute video about it, it would have to be this one, High and Low, then Drunken Angel, then The Bad Sleep Well, and then Stray Dog. I um I don't particularly like Stray Dog. I think it's very similar to High and Low, just done in like a uh much less nuanced way. And also High and Low just has like better production values and has a tighter script. And The Bat Sleep Well is pretty good, but like the ending just kind of really ruins the effect of the movie. And it's also like it's not a perfect example of capitalism. Okay, what is? But it's not. I think that movie kind of is not as critical of the system as it wants to be. It's kind of critical of like individuals being greedy, and I don't think that really ended up working as like a proper critique of capitalism in the same way that I think High and Low works.
Yeah. Well, that's a good note to end on. So, but you talked a bit about your YouTube channel and your videos. So why don't you tell people where they can find that?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is under my name, Amanda Hartsell. If I there are other people that are also called Amanda Hartsell on YouTube, but I'm the one with the Japanese videos, so you should be able to find me there.
We'll also have a link to that in the show notes, and also I think you mentioned you have a Medium site as well.
Yes, that's also under my name.
Okay, so we'll have links to both of those things in the show notes. As for us, we are japanonfilm.com, Japan on Film on the socials, which pretty much mostly Blue Sky, although we do post release announcements on Threads, Facebook, and Instagram, so make sure to check us out there. And we are part of the Film Stories podcast network, so please make sure to find out what other shows are available on there. Amanda, thanks so much for coming on. This was a great conversation. Really enjoyed watching this movie and enjoyed talking about it.
Oh, of course. It's one of my favorite movies, and I'm basically a champion of this movie at this point, trying to get it into as many people's faces as possible.
Well, you definitely succeeded for me, so thank you for that, and hopefully other people listening will check it out as well. That's all for today. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on japanonfilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.